What's up guys, Sean here, and today we're going to talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's biggest legislative proposal since the Green New Deal. So Now This put together a video with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez because I think Now This is just a part of the Ocasio-Cortez campaign team. I used to think that they were a news agency, maybe like a BuzzFeed video version kind of website, but I'm pretty sure they just do propaganda for AOC and the squad now. So they put together this video about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's biggest legislative announcement since the Green New Deal. Which is weird because the Green New Deal is a piece of legislation so embarrassingly awful that even the Democrats that endorsed it and co-sponsored it didn't vote for it in the United States Senate. So it's the biggest legislative announcement from Ocasio-Cortez since that legislative announcement that literally got no votes because it was horrifically embarrassing for the Democratic Party. But regardless of how silly the premise of the Now This video actually is, we have to go over this video because there are so many amazing things in it. Not pieces of legislation that I would actually want to see passed amazing, but ridiculously dumb and insane statistics that are somehow presented as if they're factual amazing.
America today is at its wealthiest point than in its entire history. And in fact, many would argue that today the United States represents one of the richest societies in global history.
So that microphone on the desk with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the Blue Yeti microphone. The reason I can tell it's a Blue Yeti microphone is because I, for this channel, use a Blue Yeti microphone. Yet my audio doesn't sound like I'm talking to you guys, as if I'm in a tin can. Now, one of the mistakes that people who use the Blue Yeti microphone often do is talk into the wrong portion of the Blue Yeti microphone. You're supposed to talk into the label, or at least have the label that says Blue Yeti facing you. As you can tell from the Ocasio-Cortez video, she does not have the bright part of the microphone facing her, and that's why her audio sounds absolutely awful. Now, this information isn't difficult to find out. In fact, the box that the Blue Yeti microphone comes in comes with an instruction manual. It tells you exactly where to talk into the microphone. You can actually go onto YouTube. It's an extremely popular microphone on YouTube. See the way other people are doing it. See the way people who do tutorials on how to make videos are doing this. But Ocasio-Cortez decided no to all of that, and her entire staff ignored all of that, and they decided to roll with this ridiculously bad audio as if it's acceptable, and let me just tell you, it's not acceptable whatsoever. Also, and I definitely didn't want to bring this up because you guys know me, I'm extremely progressive, and I would never go after the progressive orthodoxy on this channel, but this might possibly be the result of hiring somebody based on diversity rather than qualifications, because anybody with a little bit of sense could have said, that's not the way to use that microphone. But now that we're past the important technical issues with this Ocasio-Cortez video, let's get into the meat of the video and start with this first amazing claim.
Except among all these record profits, 40 million Americans are living in poverty, and 18.5 million Americans are living in extreme poverty, which is measured as less than $2 a day.
Okay, I have to be 100% honest. After this point that I'm going to make, the rest of this video is basically stuff that doesn't matter. Yes, I'm going to make fun of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's socialism. I'm going to make fun of her saying that everything should be a right. But this is probably the most important claim that I will ever debunk in the history of anything, because it is so ridiculous, and the idea that an alleged smart person, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is alleged to be intelligent by the Democratic Party and the left-wing media, would think that out of the 40 million Americans that are in poverty by American standards, that almost half of them, 18.5 million of them, are in extreme poverty as defined by world standards of under $2 a day, is amazing. It's absolutely stunning and completely disconnected from reality in every possible way. 18.5 million people in America, the country where I live in right now, the country where if you're homeless, you can raise more than $2 a day just by asking for money on the street, according to Ocasio-Cortez, live on under $2 a day. That's a thing that she is basing legislation on. That's a thing that she believes to be real. You know where this comes from? This comes from the United Nations. And spoiler alert, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has completely misread, misinterpreted, misunderstood what the UN's findings were. Because even the UN, a terrible, sucky organization that lectures the United States of America on behalf of dictatorships across the world, isn't this terrible. Even the UN isn't this dumb. Even the UN wouldn't make a claim this stupid. Because when you actually go into the United Nations data, they're actually measuring poverty and deep poverty by the standards set in the United States of America. And deep poverty, which is the number that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is referring to, is half of what the poverty line is in the United States of America. Which means the number that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is butchering isn't people within the United States of America living under $2 a day. It's people in the United States of America, individuals under $6,000, which is half of the $12,000 poverty line for individuals, and families of four under $12,000, which is about half of where the poverty line is for families of four in the United States of America. There is a gigantic difference between $6,000 a year, which averages out to over $16 a day, and under $2 a day. Now, it is extremely questionable whether or not there are even 18 million people living at under half of what the poverty line of the United States is in the United States of America. The Trump administration disputes these statistics, and a number of other think tanks peg that number at much lower. But what there is not a question about is how many people are living under $2 a day in America. And spoiler alert, it's not that many, because as we've said in this video, if you are homeless on the streets begging for money, you will get in change more than $2 a day. Now, one of the most interesting things I found while delving into the data on this topic was this Washington Post piece where they basically break down a lot of the arguments from the left-wing side and the right-wing side about poverty, deep poverty, and extreme poverty in America. The Washington Post article covers the Heritage Foundation, which is obviously a more conservative organization, and their methodology for estimating that about 250,000 people in the United States of America total live under $4 a day. And that data is compared and contrasted to a Princeton study, which says that about 5.3 million people in the United States of America are living on less than $4 a day. But the best thing about going through this topic and reading this article was this quote from one of the more left-leaning people on this topic. And I just want to read it for you because it's amazing. Because even the left-wing researchers think that what Ocasio-Cortez is pushing is completely absurd. Quote, "No one is claiming that there are 18.5 million people below $4 a day," Deaton said in an email. "It's hard to do this accurately. But I do think that using survey data, as the Heritage Foundation does, is certain to underestimate the problem." So even the person who is trying to dispute the right-wing figures of 250,000 people living on under $4 a day within the United States of America is like, look, nobody, and I mean nobody, would be saying that 18.5 million Americans are living on less than $4 a day. That's completely ridiculous. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez decided, no, Mr. Economist, it's not only 18.5 million people living on less than $4 a day, it's actually 18.5 million people living on less than $2 a day. She just one-upped this guy's ridiculous notion because that's who we have representing us in the United States of America. And this is a congresswoman in New York, a city that I call my home. Thank God she is not my congresswoman. Unfortunately, she gets all the attention, and she might as well be everybody's congresswoman.
And 18.5 million Americans are living in extreme poverty, which is measured as less than $2 a day.
Now, the reason I spend so much time on that is because it's important to understand that Ocasio-Cortez is starting from a point completely disconnected from reality. Now, she's proposed 5 points in her plan, and they're all completely absurd, and they were all pretty much in the Green New Deal itself. And the first one, which may start out as the least absurd one, gets absurd incredibly quickly.
Our first bill is called the Recognizing Poverty Act, which seeks to update the national poverty guidelines in order for us to acknowledge modern life, which includes geographic cost of living.
Now, after Ocasio-Cortez completely butchers poverty stats and completely inflates them to a point where any rational person should say, that literally makes no sense, she actually comes back with a not incredibly dumb point, and that's about how we measure poverty in the United States of America. And this idea that we have a national poverty line never made a lot of sense to me, and I actually agree that we should have different states and different municipalities measure poverty themselves rather than have a one-size-fits-all poverty line. The cost of living in, let's say, New York City or San Francisco is completely different than the cost of living in Mississippi or Louisiana. The cost of living in New York City is actually completely different than the cost of living in Long Island or upstate New York. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to use the same one-size-fits-all solution for different programs. That being said, people choose to live in these cities. They choose to live in these high cost of living places. So the idea that somebody who makes way more money than somebody in another part of a country should be doled out benefits on the federal level also doesn't make any sense, because Ocasio-Cortez isn't talking about leaving the minimum wage up to states and local municipalities. She wants that national. She's not talking about making the tax brackets about where you live in the country and letting the local governments decide what the tax rate should be on the rich. She also wants that at the national level. So even though it sounds like it makes sense and it's probably the least objectionable thing in this new program, it still really doesn't wash when you understand that she wants to do everything else nationally except dole out more benefits to poor people who choose to live in unaffordable places.
Which includes geographic cost of living, the price of health insurance, childcare, and new necessities like internet access.
And of course, even when I want to give her a small bit of credit for pointing out that the measure of poverty should be more regional, she goes completely off the rails and starts talking about how we have to measure your health insurance cost. We have to also measure your cost of childcare and new necessities like the internet. Yes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believes that you now have a right to internet access, which means that according to Ocasio-Cortez, throughout all of human history and American history, before the 90s, when home internet access became available for consumers in the United States of America, our rights were being violated because we didn't have our rights to the internet being met. It's a necessity now, so it's somehow a human right. Completely ridiculous, complete nonsense. And most Americans do have access to the internet, whether it's limited access through mobile phones or through a home broadband network. You don't need to make something a right for people to have it. Most Americans have TVs, most Americans have computers. This doesn't need to be a natural right or a right provided by the government. Most people manage to get telephone service in their home without it being declared a natural right by somebody in Congress. In fact, the greatest barrier to people getting telephones in their home was a monopoly granted to AT&T by the federal government. As soon as that was broken up, people started getting telephone service faster, more affordable, and cheaper.
A just society is one where there is decent and fair housing, and that it is looked at as a human right.
Now, the next thing she cuts to is that every American needs a place to prosper, aka a right to housing, aka one of the most disastrous and idiotic policies ever tried in the history of the world. South Africa's constitution guarantees a right to housing. There are incredible shortages in housing because the government is not the best mechanism to deliver housing to people in a country.
It begins in 2017 when our landlords sold their property to new business developers, and then they in turn came in with the $300 pay increase. People that are supportive of this cause, you stand no chance in the eviction court system. What is going on with these greedy landlords is very unjust.
We get a sob story about a woman whose building was sold to another landlord who had her rent raised $300 a month, and we're told, or it's implied, that she was evicted because she says, well, you don't have any chance in the eviction courts. Now look, I am sympathetic to somebody having their rent raised $300 a month. That exact same thing happened to me after I was gifted a couch by a friend and we decided to do some redecorating in the apartment. Our landlord got it in their mind that we somehow had a giant pay increase by somebody in the household, and they decided that they were going to raise our rent for the first time in 10 years by $300 a month. That's a lot of money, and we did not get a pay increase in the family, so it was difficult to pay that rent increase. but we had the choice of whether or not we wanted to move somewhere else or stay in the apartment that we had been living in for a long time, and we made the choice to stay. This woman could have chosen to leave that apartment voluntarily rather than stay in a place that she knew she couldn't afford to the point where she got evicted.
Our second piece of legislation is called the Place to Prosper Act, which creates a national access to counsel fund for all renters in America who are currently facing eviction.
And for the record, making it more difficult to evict somebody who doesn't pay their rent will not help renters in the long term. It will only help deadbeats stay in apartments that they're not willing to pay for. In my building, we had a situation where one of our tenants was not able to pay their rent. Basically, what happened is that they were a part of a couple. They ended up breaking up after moving into the apartment, and without both incomes in the household, they could not afford to continue to pay their rent. So my landlord, being the nice person that she was, gave them some time and accepted smaller and smaller payments over time in order to let them catch up and eventually pay their rent. Well, it turns out they never could, and they kept stiffing them month after month, so my landlord went through the New York City eviction process, which she described to me as a complete and total nightmare, because in New York City, you can't evict somebody in bad weather, you can't evict somebody on holidays. If the person you're trying to evict has children, there are more hoops to go through. You have to give them 90 days notice. If you're accepting partial rent payments, then that could actually work against you. So if you're being a more generous landlord, and you're trying to take something in good faith, that actually ends up hurting you in a court battle. So the idea that you're going to make this process more difficult and think that's going to make landlords more generous or more nice to people, it's not going to work. It's going to have the exact opposite effect. If I'm ever fortunate enough to not only own property, but to be able to own enough property that I can rent part of it to other people, based on what I know now, I'm not renting it to any couple that doesn't have one party capable of covering the rent, just based on what I've learned now. Now, if you're going to use the force of government to try and extend the eviction process nationally, then I'm not renting to anybody without a gigantic security deposit and even more assurances, which means that poor people who are on the margins that I might let rent a space from me, I definitely wouldn't let them rent it from me because it's way too big of a risk, because Ocasio-Cortez is essentially arming deadbeats with the power of the legal system to make sure I lose money on my property. So yeah, this would have the exact opposite effect of what she intends.
It also imposes a national cap of 3% on annual rent increases and begins to pursue penalties on abusive and predatory landlords so that they don't hurt any other family again.
So if you're not very smart, a 3% cap on rent increases might sound like an ingenious policy idea. But again, this is something that has been tried and it completely backfires. So in New York, we have a lot of sections of the city that are rent controlled, which means that the government of New York limits the amount of rent increases that you can put on a specific place. And one of the things that landlords who own these rent-controlled units are now doing is trying to get the tenants out of the apartments so that they can then Airbnb them, so then they can follow that up by renting them at a much higher rate. Because you can't raise rent on the same tenants, that incentivizes you to get rid of the tenants that you have if there's a market shift, so you can charge new tenants way more money. So capping rent increases actually makes it less likely that people will stay in their current residence, because all of the incentives for the landlord are lined up in such a way that they want to get them out of the apartment. It also disincentivizes new building, because if you can build a new building, but you know that that building won't keep up with market rates of rent, then why are you going to do that? And we desperately need, in these high rent cities, more buildings and more rentable units. But this policy will completely do the opposite.
It's been really hard for me to find housing. I have the money to move places and stuff, but they deny me for my felony history. It's not right, you know. So no matter what, every place I go to, they try to force me to a certain area in town.
So we're greeted with the first white guy in this video, and of course he's a convicted felon with face tattoos, which I think is a very interesting choice for Ocasio-Cortez to make this point. I believe it was deliberate because you have a very race-conscious congresswoman, and she wouldn't want to portray a minority as a convicted felon. But I find it incredibly interesting that he's talking about restrictions on where he's allowed to live, because there's a very special type of felony that usually comes with those living restrictions. Now, if I tell you what felony I'm specifically thinking of, I may get hit with demonetization, so I'm just going to leave that thought there and let the internet sleuths of the world investigate exactly what this guy was convicted of, because again, I have no idea, but I would be fascinated to learn if this one person that she decided to include in this video was convicted of that type of felony.
The Embrace Act also ends this type of federal public benefits discrimination based on one's immigration status. A just society embraces our immigrants.
Now, the next plank in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Just Society program is welfare for illegal immigrants. That's right, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the woman who advocates for abolishing ICE, aka people who enforce our border laws, a woman who advocates for not enforcing our border laws, somebody who's in favor of open borders, is now calling for welfare for the people that cross through our open borders. Because that totally won't bankrupt the country, giving illegal immigrants not only all of the benefits that they're entitled to now, but all of the increased benefits that Ocasio-Cortez is promising them. Now look, I am not as hawkish on immigration as many of the people on my side of the aisle on YouTube, my contemporaries, seem to be, but this is way, way too far. I would support a sensible immigration program where we actually examine the people who came to this country illegally. We examine how long they've been here, but more importantly, we examine how much they contribute to this country, and then we make a decision on whether or not we want to keep that person or send them back to their country of origin. But no, absolutely no way am I going to support giving all illegal immigrants unlimited access to the seemingly unlimited welfare benefits that Ocasio-Cortez supports. If you want to come here, take a chance, take some risks, see if you can make the American dream work for you, then I say that you're welcome and you have the right spirit to become an American eventually. But if you want to come here because Ocasio-Cortez is promising you a right to housing, internet access, unlimited childcare, free education, free healthcare, then believe me, you definitely don't belong here, because those promises are never going to happen, and if they do, they will completely bankrupt this country and bankrupt the people who actually work for a living in this country.
A just society is a participatory member in our global community. That's why our final piece of legislation is a resolution that directs the Senate to finally ratify the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which guarantees a modern set of human rights that includes housing, healthcare, and education.
Now, her final point is that the United States Senate should ratify this UN Covenant that basically guarantees as rights a bunch of stuff that you should pay for on your own. The United States does not consider rights in the same way that this UN Covenant does. Look at our Bill of Rights. They're all freedoms from government intervention in your lives. They're not free stuff from the government. That's not how our system of government works. That's not how our Constitution works. That's not how the idea of America works. Even things that are provided by the government are not rights, they're public goods. We don't talk about these things in terms of rights. Only people on the far left talk about them that way. But hey, what can you expect from somebody who is incapable of operating a $90 microphone? Anyway, that's all I really have for you guys today. Let me know what you think about Ocasio-Cortez's Just Society in the comments down below. If you like this video, then please show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. Follow me on all the social medias. If you want to support me, you can do so via one-time donation on Venmo or PayPal, or monthly through Patreon and Subscribestar. This has been me taking down a Now This Ocasio-Cortez campaign merger video. Next time.